Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I have a distinguished law professor with me today, Robin Boyle-Laisure, who I've had the pleasure to know over a number of years. And Robin, you're at the St. John's University School of Law, where you teach and write. And I grew up literally on 172nd Street in Union Turnpike, across the street from where you work. And on the other side of St. John's was Jamaica Estates, where Donald Trump's childhood home was, just for those people who are curious about, where are you from, Steve? Queens. In any case, Robin, you are a board member of the International Cultic Studies Association, and we were at Barcelona at the last conference. You've been doing presentations all over the world concerning human trafficking, coercive control, and high demand groups. You've done articles, essays, book chapters, and you were one of the first people to say, we should use trafficking laws to go after cult leaders. And I was like, yes, which helped spur me on eventually to do my doctoral dissertation based on using trafficking law on my BITE model. I'm almost finished with your laudatories. You're currently writing a parenting book called Taken No More, Protecting Your Children Against Traffickers and Cults. You're the author of a legal textbook teaching contract drafting. I want to talk to you about contract law and how cults are abusing that. All I can say is you are a social justice warrior, and I am so grateful to you for everything you're doing. How did you get interested in the subject of undue influence?
Well, first, I want to thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm very thrilled to be here and honored, and I've been following your work for so many years, and it's great to catch up with you again. I also want to clarify my name. My earlier work was published under Robin Boyle, and that was my main name. I got married and I added Laisure. So some pieces people will find me under Boyle. Some people will find me under Robin Boyle-Laisure.
Good. Boyle, and we'll do a blog and we'll have all the links
and all the links. That's great. So good. You asked how I got interested. It was I would have to say my interest started to peak when I was a college student, and I was a college student at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, and I was very involved as an activist on campus. And there was a lot of interesting issues at the time. This was in the 1970s. So we had issues going on in terms of on campus, it was divestment of funds that were in South Africa. But off campus, we had nuclear power and some other issues like the Equal Rights Amendment. And what I noticed is that the dynamics of activism, and when outsiders came to campus who had a lot of experience and a lot of influence, I noticed how our dynamics as students changed when someone with experience and may have been a paid organizer or not a paid organizer, but came to campus and kind of rallied students towards particular causes. And some of the tactics raised some red flags for me. And it wasn't until I was a law student later when I was talking to a college classmate of mine who introduced me to the partner at her firm, who was Herb Rosedale. Now, Herb Rosedale at the time was president of the American Family Foundation. That organization is no longer in existence. What has now taken its place is the International Cultic Studies Association.
Better name,
referred to often as ICCSA. But AFF its earlier version, was run at that time by Herb Rosedale. Now, Herb was an attorney at Parker Chapin Law Firm, and he did a lot of pro bono work in this area regarding cults.
He helped me many times with all of my, threats against me by cults and such. He's a good guy.
He was a great man, and he sat down and met with me, and he told me what the American Family Foundation does, how there were many people involved who are helping people exit cults, and in their group was the mental health professionals, lawyers, academicians, sociologists, medical doctors, psychologists. It was a mix of people as well as former cult members. And I told him I was working on an article at the time, and he told him about it, and he invited me to be what we called a featured luncheon speaker at their annual meeting. And this was in the late 90s. And I said, sure. And I spoke, and that was a very interesting experience to meet people with the organization and go to the workshops. I wrote an article at the time that got published in their journal. And then he invited me back the following year, also featured luncheon speaker. I also addressed different legal avenues that cult victims might be able to use at that time. Also, that article got published in the journal. And that's how it grew. It just grew from there. And Herb said to me something really poignant. He said, I have to warn you, once you start researching and getting involved in this field, you'll never be able to let it go.
I can relate to that one. It's so important to humanity, and it's utterly fascinating because you're constantly learning about the mind and social psychology. So I got bitten by the bug myself.
And so here it is, 2024. Yep. I had met her so many decades ago, and I haven't been able to let it go. I've gone on to write many articles, and now I'm working on this book. And it's really been very educational for me and very rewarding work.
Right. So tell us how you realized, and you wrote this journal article, that, hey, we should use trafficking laws to go after cult leaders.
Sure. So I'll just hold up the reprint cover.
Great.
It was published by the Oregon Review of International Law back in 2016. And then it was reprinted by ICCSA, reprinted it in their journal a few years later. I had finished, I teach at St. John's, as you had said, St. John's Law School. The classes had ended, and it gave me time to breathe and to think about what's my next topic. And I'm interested in going back and writing more about cults again. Right. But what legal issues are there? And I was just kind of like, what could I write about? And then I thought, wait a minute, there's got to be this angle of the human trafficking laws. And so I started looking into the human trafficking laws, and I realized that there was so much parallel that could occur, and I started to develop the article in terms of what the laws are and how that matched many characteristics of cult leaders.
Right.
And their victims.
Yeah.
And that developed into this article. And I managed to write, I don't know, about 30 some odd pages about it. But I described the different types of cults, which I know you've written about too, political cults. And I also wrote about terrorist groups as cults and so forth. I described them. I talked about the human trafficking law and what trafficking is. Right? It's a selling of people for the perpetrator's gain. So there's coercion involved. And I compared that to coercion that's involved in cults. And I looked at whether any physical force was used, and physical force is sometimes used in destructive cult.
Right.
Psychological concerns, that runs across the board in both of these camps, human trafficking with cults.
Yep.
Labor and profit motives of cults, they're in line to make a business. A cult is a business. And that's what they do. Fraudulent recruitment, which occurs with human trafficking, with grooming, and romanticism sometimes for sex trafficking, and deceptive tactics also happens with cults, as we know. You've written about how you were lured into the Moonies, right?
Sure, of course.
And isolation with cults, they very much isolate their members and keep them out of communication with their former family and friends. Similar with traffickers, they do the same thing, both in sex trafficking and in labor trafficking. Shaming tactics, embarrassing, shunning, those kind of tactics. Threats that are used.
Right.
So I developed this kind of parallel approach of showing how traffickers do very similar things to what cult leaders do. And hey, it's been so hard. Prior to this, it was very hard to succeed in court on a theory of brainwashing.
Right.
The courts weren't buying brainwashing. So if they're not buying brainwashing, let's take that off the agenda and let's look at what these cults are actually doing and find a structure, a framework by which we can prosecute.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was how this article developed.
So let me tell my listeners, many of whom have seen The Vow on HBO about the NXIVM cult or Seduced. And Keith Raniere was sentenced to 120 years in jail for trafficking. Not brainwashing or mind control, but trafficking. And he wasn't selling women, but he was mind controlling women as sex toys for himself. And of course, the extraction of large amounts of money. But that opened the door to Larry Ray getting sentenced, the Sarah Lawrence cult figure, to jail, and R. Kelly. So this has been a very novel and important development that you've contributed to.
And, thank you. But I also want to add one other piece of history, which you brought to light, Stephen, which was the Rachel Thomas case. Okay. And how an individual was caught up in a modeling, what she thought was a modeling agency. She was a student at college in the
Emory
Atlanta
College,
in the Atlanta area, and sure enough, what was promised to her as a modeling agency turned out to be something very different. It turned out to be a commercial sex operation, which she was coerced into participating in. And when this came to light, they had several women from several different schools all complaining of the same thing.
Right. So just to come back to ICCSA for a second, I put together the first panel with sex trafficking survivors as a cult phenomenon. I think it was in Philadelphia or in DC. Rachel came and presented for that, and Christine Marie Cadis also spoke there. That was a very interesting panel discussion. And Rachel and I went on with Carissa Phelps to develop Ending the Game, which was a 10-session program for young women who had been sex trafficked, led by survivors of sex trafficking, explaining pimp and trafficker mind control. Because what the police were saying is that people would be taken into custody, they were minors, and going back to their pimp 12 to 14 times because they thought the pimp loved them, but it was basically because they had been brainwashed.
Yes.
So that was very valuable. And I think it's in 35 states now, Ending the Game. I'm very proud of that.
Well, that's very valuable. So
Yeah.
thank you for doing that.
Yeah. So talk to us about the book that you're writing. Why a
Sure.
parenting book, and what are you learning that we want to give a
Oh,
preview to
well,
people?
I'll tell you how it came about and why it came about. I had been doing some local presentations before church groups and high school assemblies
Mm-hmm.
and nonprofit organizations. And while I was presenting, I always felt this need to be able to say, here, let your parent read this book.
Right.
And instead, I had academic articles, and I presented before a high school assembly. And it was a very rewarding experience, and I hope it was informative. I think it was. And one of the teachers said to me that her students were given my articles. And I thought to myself, that's great, but I wish there was something that was more written for a layperson, not for a lawyer.
Right.
And so that was my motivation to write the book. Also, when I was talking to mothers, I was online. This was during the pandemic. It was a nonprofit, invited me to speak. There were 150 people online on Zoom, mothers and teenage daughters, some fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, the mother said, I'm so scared now. I don't want to send my daughter to college, or should we be looking for a local college? I realized how much what I was saying was influencing their future decisions and very
Right.
important decisions. And I thought to myself, let me counter that and explain to her you should be teaching your child how to travel safely, how to navigate the world
Right.
with confidence and with knowledge. And that was also one of the reasons why I thought I should write a book that puts everything in balance, that explains the dangers, but also explains how to talk to your child, things to say, how to educate your child. And with that, I then set off to look for an agent, which took some time. Found a wonderful agent. Shoshana Crichton is my agent. She runs a literary agency by that name. And she sent the proposal, and it was accepted by Bloomsbury. And the book is due, the manuscript is due in December, and it will be out next year in 2025. The title is Taken No More, Protecting Your Children Against Human Trafficking and Cults. And that's the title.
Yeah.
So I've been working on it. I work on it every day. And the nice thing is I am pulling together, I have a mini library at home of ICCSA publications and books that are in Barnes & Noble and on Amazon, all of your books, Stephen, I'm pretty sure I have in my mini library. And it has allowed me to reach into this treasure trove of information. There
Right.
is a lot of information out there about what cults are, and we have very astute researchers who have studied cults and have put together these fabulous articles. So I've been reading articles and pulling that together and pouring it into the book and these popular books that are on the market.
That's great. All I can hope is that you also cover internet cults and how much hypnosis is happening online that's not being called hypnosis and NLP, and how these profiles have been developed based on accruing or buying people's personal information from the dark web, and where cults can literally buy profile information and approach people who don't know that there's a program being exerted against them. For example, there's a company in Colorado called Gloo, Gloo, that will sell you information. And when young people or anybody is searching online for depression, or how do I kill myself, or other kinds of I'm having anxiety attacks, I can't sleep. Well, this gets collected, and then they can sell this data. So and so is in a weak, vulnerable place, and a cult can invite them for a Bible study or free volleyball lessons or something like that. And it feels like it's spiritual, or it feels like it's mystical, because they're not going to say, we bought your info and we know you're looking for something. And I guess the number one thing I hope you emphasize, I'm sure you will in your book, is that everybody thinks I'm too smart for it to happen to me. My kids are good kids, they're too smart. And it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with just education about how predators and perpetrators know how to manipulate people's consciousness and turn them against their family, sometimes inculcating false memories of sexual abuse or other things. To just don't tell your family, they're toxic, and because they want to isolate in order to program young people.
Yes. I sprinkle the book with vignettes, stories
Perfect.
of those who have been trafficked or those who have come out of cults. And I get these vignettes from a variety of sources. The one in the opening chapter is about a young teenage boy who was playing video games, and somehow these traffickers found him and they targeted him and they groomed him for maybe 6 months and convinced him that they were kind of like him. He didn't know that these were grown men.
Right.
And whatever they said to him convinced him, and he was a good kid in a good home, what we would call a good home.
Sure.
He got up in the middle of the night and went outside to their waiting car. They tossed his cell phone on the lawn and off he went. Now, luckily, his parents realized he was gone right away. His parents were very savvy. They were online. They contacted the authorities right away, and they were able to find him within 48 hours.
That's amazing.
How traumatic is that? And it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, and I've heard of young people being sex trafficked, living at home, going to high school, but and being told, if you don't do what we tell you, we're going to out you to your parents, or we're going to out you to all your all your high school classmates, because they often get pictures, sex pictures of them, etc., and blackmail young people into doing things. And it's really epidemic. So, can I switch gears for a minute?
Sure.
Because I want to tap your expertise as a law professor. So, do you know who Faith Jones is by any chance? Ex-Children of God lawyer.
I am familiar with Children of God.
Yeah. So she became a lawyer, and she created a construct called I Own Me, using contract law. And she said, especially women should own their bodies. And therefore, if someone is trying to have sex with you and you don't want them to have sex with you, that should be a violation. And so she has a whole theory that she wrote a little book and a TEDx talk about that. And I wondered what your thoughts are about trying to apply contract law to the sense that I own me.
Well, I applaud someone who came up with a theory like that, because we've had trouble trying to come up with the theories that tanked Roe versus Wade, in terms of having a constitutional right to control your own body. And that ran into trouble, as we know, in the U.S. Supreme Court with the Dobbs decision.
Yes.
Coming up with another theory is, I applaud someone for that. The only downside I can see on base with contract theory is that the other person has to agree. So contract is between two people, at least two people. So it's not just a contract with yourself, but it is a contract with someone else. I can foresee that if you're entering a relationship, you could bring up, just like a prenup, for instance, a prenuptial agreement before a marriage, there are provisions that both parties agree to and sign before getting married, if that is the route a couple chooses. For this kind of, from what you're telling me, it sounds like someone would need to agree to this in order for it to be violated.
Well, you just taught me something, because I hadn't thought about the contract needs two parties. So let me continue to take advantage of your expertise. So, as you know, I've gotten very interested in the law. I'm part of a forensic think tank at Harvard Medical School called the Program in Psychiatry
I
and the
spoke
Law.
to them. You invited me.
Thank you for reminding me. Great. We're going to have you back again to talk more. But so a lot of mind control cults are deceptively recruiting people and getting them to sign contracts very early on for binding arbitration or non-disclosure agreements and such. And when people are exiting, these things get summons by the cult attorneys saying, well, they made the decision, they signed it, they could have brought it to a lawyer to, but they didn't. That's on them. What do you think? What do you say to that?
What I say to that is be careful what you sign. A non-disclosure agreement has that effect, which is to silence. But we also know with the Me Too movement, what started that movement was women who were silenced, who refused to be held to the non-disclosure agreements that they signed.
Right.
So you could take a risk and break it. You'd have to be prepared to litigate it and to defend it. The arbitration agreement's the same thing, although if you are in contract, let's say you sign an agreement with a vacation club, for instance, and it says that there's an arbitration clause that you agree to in that vacation club agreement, the courts will abide by that. So that is a legal provision depending upon what it says. So my advice is, 1, be careful of what you sign. 2, seek help from a lawyer if you can before signing to get another opinion. And 3, if you're willing to break a non-disclosure agreement, also seek lawyer's assistance.
Right. So put that in your book too, because in my opinion, a lot of people don't have the money, or they don't even think, is there a lawyer that I can afford to review a contract or something? I know I see these 30-page small print things when I'm getting an app or something. I don't read every single line. It gives me a headache. It's too small. And I just see this happening more and more, where people are signing their rights away. And and this is an abuse of the law.
Right. Also be careful of something else, which is contracts. When you enter into contracts with, let's just take the vacation club example again. There may be a provision that says anything we've discussed is not included in the contract. So it's only what is in writing is what is contractual. Be careful of those kind of provisions, because if whoever it is you're negotiating with, whether it's a vacation club or whether it's what turns out to be a cult, whatever it might be,
right,
if they are making representations about who they are and what they provide and what they're going to do in the future, if that's not in writing and you've got this clause there that says whatever we've talked about doesn't matter, then whatever they talked about doesn't matter. It's all poof.
That's so interesting. And, until you have a situation, or a friend or a family member has a situation, so many of these things just, you're not filtering for things like that.
Right.
You just aren't.
So very often in negotiations, you might think whatever they told you sounds great. And then they read you they give you, as you said, a very long contract with a lot of fine print, and it goes on for pages and pages. But guess what? What they told you might not be in print. And somewhere in there is a buried clause that says none of that mattered.
Right.
Only what's in print matters.
Right. I learned that the hard way, and I get interviewed a lot, and I get these contracts that they want me to sign, and I learned the hard way that I have to either say no, or I have to pay my lawyer to go through it, because some of these things, it's signing my likeness over to them, not for that interview. Signing my likeness, or just things that I would never agree to in a million years. And
so on that, that's one of the reasons I went and found an agent to represent me.
Yeah.
In placing my book proposal, because agents also know what to look for and what to negotiate. And she did a lot of good work for me.
Yeah. And that's how they earn their percentage of your royalties and stuff.
That's right. You do have to, give them a percentage of your royalties. That's correct.
Yeah. So talk to me about what your understanding of hypnosis is in the law. And because I'm seeing more and more where people are being told they're going to have a guided meditation. They're not using the word hypnosis, but it is hypnosis. And people are being taken advantage of by lies and mistruths. And, for example, stage hypnotists say something that's patently false. They say typically, you would never do in trance anything you wouldn't ordinarily want to do. And
but then why are they on stage?
Then they're on stage and they're being told that they're naked, and even though they're not, but they believe they're naked, and they're covering their genitals, and everyone's laughing at them because they believe that they're naked.
So my guess is that, without being given a lot of the facts, my guess is that the venue had participants sign a release so that those kinds of statements and that act would be protected. Because if the participants signed a release saying that they would not sue, then they don't have a cause of action if they signed a release waiving their rights to sue. Now, of course, we're talking very generally and hypothetically.
Right.
But the question is whether they signed a release, a waiver and a release. And what that does is it relinquishes the potential plaintiff's ability to bring a lawsuit.
Right. So what about psychics and so-called, reincarnated spiritual masters from the continent of Atlantis and other things like that, making these claims about themselves, and where people are paying money every month to take classes or to be part of this organization. And over time, people are being told, well, you don't need to go to school, and you should get rid of any, negative forces in your life, people who are trying to undercut you.
So be cautious as a consumer. But there also is very strong, at least in the United States and in many countries, a protection for freedom of religion, right? We hold very strongly to the belief in our Constitution that a person has the freedom to exercise their religious beliefs. And the courts are loath to get involved in that. They really do back off from inquiring about the legitimacy of what the organization is saying. They're not going to do that. The question is whether the participant truly held that belief. But basically, because of the First Amendment protections for free exercise of religion, a lot of cults have continued to practice in the way in which they have practiced because the courts don't want to get involved in that because of our constitutional protections. And like anything, that's why I always look to the law outside of free exercise, religion, First Amendment claims. I look to trafficking, representations, etc., undue influence, these other laws. Which, can I talk about undue influence now?
Please.
Is this a good time?
It's great.
So I was really curious about undue influence. And thank you for inviting me to speak to that Harvard psychoanalytic think tank.
It's not psychoanalytic. It's a forensic think tank.
Think tank. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
I appreciate that invitation. And I talked to them about this idea that I had for an article. And then I did finally get around to writing the article. So the article, and here I have the cover that I could show you of the reprint. So the article is called Undoing Undue Influence, How the Doctrine Can Avoid Judicial Subjectivity by Omitting the Vulnerability Element. And it was published in the American Journal of Trial Advocacy this fall, 2023. So last fall, it just came out in print. So my theory here is, just like free exercise of religion is just a morass in terms of trying to have the courts agree that something is a cult, it's not a good way to go. And just like trying to convince a court that someone has been brainwashed, that's also has not been always a successful litigation strategy. However, undue influence has a problem. And the theory of undue influence has stemmed from cases in which you have an aging parent or grandparent who decide at the last minute to bequeath their estate to someone who isn't related, to someone who came into their life very recently. And then those who feel as if they were gypped after the person passes, they bring a case under undue influence to the court to try to get the courts to undo what was bequeathed to this outsider. That's the premise for undue influence. But it's also been used or tried to be used by people who have been misrepresented by cults, and they're trying to get their money back because fraudulent pretenses were used. The cult took all their money, and they're looking to undue influence or some kind of theory under which they could succeed. The problem with using undue influence up until this point has been that the courts look at the vulnerability element. Is the person who gave away all their money, is that person mentally unstable, not working with all of their faculties? My theory is, let's take that emphasis away. Let's not look at the vulnerabilities of the person who did the generous deed. Let's instead look at the culpability of the organization that's trying to take their money.
Exactly.
And so let's shift our emphasis. And my theory, and I know you've written on undue influence and mind control and so forth. So this is how it would sound if I could wave a magic wand and have the courts adopt this.
Yep.
Undue influence happens when an individual or organization uses coercive control against another individual, causing that individual to transfer anything of value for the benefit of the influencer.
Mm-hmm.
The tactics of coercive control used by the influencer may include any one or more of the following. And then there's a list of factors,
right,
such as control over their daily living and where they live, what they eat, where they work, hours they sleep, what they wear for clothes, their finances, reproductive rights. Other tactics would be incessant requests, displaying hostility, anger, violence, or intimidation, isolation of the target from family and friends and other support systems, tactics of the influencer, and also invitations for courts to analyze the vulnerability of the target.
yeah,
So in other
bite
words,
model stuff, in other words.
bite model stuff. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I mentioned your bite model, which, by the way, at the Barcelona conference last summer held by ICCSA, bite model was discussed in many of the workshops. So you've done a really good job in getting that model out there and getting people to think about it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Alan Shefflin's social influence model helped, and that was the forensic think tank that told me to do a quantitative study on the bite model and show that it's scientific. And so that's moving the ball a little bit further to show that.
Yes.
But it's very important to take the concept of undue influence, as you said. The history is about property being given to not your heirs, but to third parties, but to really start thinking about in terms of controlling minds, psychological control of another person. And that's where I really think that the law needs to get updated. And I agree with you right now, especially with the current Supreme Court in the United States. The idea of any group that says it's a religion, hands off. But and NXIVM, he went to jail because it wasn't a religion; it was a coaching organization. Same thing with Larry Ray, was not
Right.
was not a religion. But
I'm so glad you raised NXIVM.
yes, please.
If I could just jump in on that one, because that was such a significant trial and such a significant victory that Keith Raniere, the cult leader, was found guilty on all 7 counts that they brought against him. Yes, it was human trafficking as well as racketeering and some other charges. But that was really a fascinating trial. I did have the opportunity to attend some of the trial, and here Mark Vicente and some other witnesses testified.
Former members.
Yeah. And it was interesting in that there were celebrities that were caught up in it, which of course caught the press's attention, which then got the federal agents involved in investigating, and then a case came about as a result. Mm-hmm. But the amount of influence that Raniere had over those individuals was significant. Also interesting in that cult is that they use collateral. And you were mentioning before about blackmailing, sex trafficking. Well, in NXIVM, they would ask workshop participants to provide them, write down something embarrassing, something they don't want to make public. And then they would turn that over to the organization. And they said, we are holding collateral as a way to basically as a way to manipulate them. So therefore, if they tried to leave or tried to do something, they used it as a leverage over them.
Exactly.
Now, some of the people who were involved in NXIVM said that, they were running out of material. So they would make stories up that would be embarrassing for their family, that would humiliate people they had loved before they
Yes.
joined NXIVM. And all of this was being stockpiled. Not only that, as you mentioned, pictures, they had a separate group of women. It was called DOS,
Right.
DOS, and they were considered sex masters and sex slaves. It was a secret organization. Those were the women who were branded. Our listeners probably have heard of the branding that occurred on their pelvic bone. And they were asked, and I was in court when this testimony came out, that they were asked to strip naked as a group in front of each other, take pictures, and send them off. And they went to Keith Raniere, who wasn't there. He was somewhere else. And he either approved or disapproved. If he disapproved, they had to do them over again.
Right.
Or there was all sorts of horrible things that they were forced to do.
Right.
And those pictures were also part of the collateral.
Right. Right.
When I heard collateral, I said, oh my gosh, that is significant. I think the feds have them on this one. I can see this, prosecution playing out in favor of the government. It was significant.
Yeah, it really was. On the topic of NXIVM, and this is a little side move, but it involves India Oxenberg, the daughter of Catherine Oxenberg, the celebrity that I think you alluded to.
Mm-hmm.
So during the run-up to the trial and through the trial, the cult hired one of the leading forensic psychiatrists in the world, a man named Park Dietz, to evaluate India Oxenberg for whether she was brainwashed or not. And a few months ago, I Zoomed with India and I asked her about this, because one of the things that I'm wanting to work on in 2025, and I'd love your involvement, Robin, is to develop the ideal model forensic evaluation for a current cult member.
Interesting.
And what India told me is that they had prepped her for the interview and taught her how to lie and what to say about many of the questions. And I asked her, are you willing to, be public about this? Because I'd love to use your story and what happened with you as a case example of why we need such a model forensic evaluation. And she's totally game for it. But it was very powerful for a lot of the cult members and confusing for ex-members, because here was this forensic psychiatrist saying there's no evidence she's brainwashed at all. She's thinking clearly and making her own decisions. And it was just wrong.
Right.
What do you think?
I'm coming across a lot of this information when I'm looking at the publications that International Cultic Studies Association has been producing in its journals in the past 5 or so years, 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some interesting studies that I'm finding of interviews that took place, and the researchers did it in the form of narrative interviews. So they would ask, for instance, Cindy Matthews did one asking participants who have exited a cult certain questions, and then asking the same questions to each of the participants, and then going back and repeating the questions. So it's set out in these different articles, but it's a very interesting technique of getting at the information and then culling through the information. And what they find is that they were not making their own decisions. Particularly, I think perhaps it was more startling when they left the cult, because then they were not able to make decisions about finances or knew how to navigate finances, or even how to cook, or what to wear, or any of those kinds of things that the rest of us who have grown up outside of a cult, let's say, are familiar with.
Right. Right.
So, but there are some interesting studies, and I suggest you take a look, and I can point you to the ones that I've come across recently that are took that narrative research approach in their studies and look at the kinds of questions they asked the former cult members to see if those questions could work with current cult members.
Right. Well, I have my own thoughts on what that evaluation would need to include. For example, interviewing family and friends who knew the person before they got inducted into the cult to develop a clear profile. Not just doing a one-on-one interview. But having that background, talking to ex-members, if it's a known group, to understand the language structure, the policies, the beliefs, etc. But then asking questions that violate the stereotypical cult member profile, such as one of my favorites is I asked these thought experiment questions. For example, if I talk to a Mooney, the cult that I was in, and he's dead now, but we'll go back in time when he was alive. I'd ask somebody a question like, "What would you do if Father, meaning Moon, was on stage one day and he said, 'I have an important confession to make. I've seen a psychiatrist and I'm now on psychiatric medication, and I realize I'm not the Messiah. Go home.' What would you do?" And the cult member would always say he'd never do that. And I'd say, "I agree with you. The likelihood is very small to nil. But what would you do if the Messiah himself said he's not the Messiah and told you to go home?"
Do you know what I think cult members would say?
I'm sure.
My guess is that they would say, "Oh, he doesn't mean that. He is the Messiah. He's mistaken."
No. So in reality, they would go through any number of permutations to try to stay there. But
that's right.
But once you so we'll move on to another one. Another one that I like to ask is, so how many years have you been in the group? Oh, 10 years. During that time, have you made any really good friends? Oh, yes, I've made many good friends. So in that time, those many good friends, has anyone ever left the organization? Yes, of course. So I'm curious, when one of your very good friends left the organization, did you ask them why did they leave? And the answer typically is, I wouldn't bother with that. And then I'd be like, I'm curious, but they were your friend. Aren't you curious to know why they left? So the idea is to ask questions that the person's not primed for, that actually provokes some critical thinking and evaluation.
Right. So I guess the question is, what is the goal? If it's to have them develop critical thinking skills, those are questions that you could ask. Another goal is, are you evaluating whether there is some mind control happening at that time? Then we're also looking for responses that we can compare across the board.
Right. So, what would need to happen for you to decide it's time for you to leave is another open-ended question. And then if they say, I would never leave no matter what, well, what if you found out that the leader was raping children? Would that cause you to want to leave? Oh, he would never do that. Yeah, but if you found out to your satisfaction overwhelming evidence, would that be enough to cause you to leave? When you're in a mind control cult, you're not allowed to leave. You just don't have that ability to think outside of the box. That's part of my work when I'm helping people, is to open the door to blind faith, to imagine a future where you're not part of the group anymore, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But
good questions. Good questions.
Or another favorite of mine is tell me 3 things you don't like about the group or about the leader. Oh, he's great. I love him. No. Human beings, there's always something that you don't like about somebody. Tell me 3 things you don't like about Elizabeth Clare Prophet or Sun Myung Moon or Ron Hubbard. And cult members can't say a negative thing. They're not allowed to say anything negative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, the downside of all of this is that once we write it up, the cult lawyers will read it and will prep cult members to lie.
To say.
So it's going to be a complex system, cat and mouse game, maybe. But I just really believe that we need to push the boulder up the hill some more, and come up with some real guidelines that as opposed to just accepting what one-on-one answers are given to you.
That sounds good. Sounds great. I would love to work on that project.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I can tell you one biggie is that, like, I'm pretty well known in the Moonies. To say to a current Moonie, there's a man in the other room I'd like to introduce you to. It's Steve Hassan, because I'd be very interested to hear how you interact with him. That would be a really interesting experience, because because of the program phobias, right? Can you imagine a NXIVM true believer, being asked to speak with Mark Vicente and hear what his objections were to his involvement with Keith Raniere? That would freak him out.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
He was such a good witness. Oh my gosh.
For everyone who doesn't know, Mark Vicente was the filmmaker. He was a prior filmmaker before the cult, but Keith Raniere designated him to make films to record the historic, achievements of Keith Raniere and the cult. And all that footage got turned into the Vow. And he really did have access to the, a lot of the critical information that put him away permanently. It's really great.
That put Raniere away. Yes.
That put Raniere away. Thank you for clarifying. So as we're wrapping up, Robin,
this is wonderful. I really enjoyed catching up with you. I enjoyed your talk in Barcelona. That was great. That was a wonderful conference.
Yeah.
And ICCSA is having another one next summer in Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
And
around July
4th. And that's open to the public. Registration will be running on ICCSA's website. And
so what I want to propose to you is, let's do a panel at the ABA or something for lawyers and judges.
Good idea.
I did one with Steve Eichel and Alan Shefflin years ago. I'm not sure if Herb was there or not, but we really want to educate more lawyers and judges about this whole phenomenon.
And I did one with Alan Shefflin for the Federal Bar Association in the Eastern District of New York.
Yeah.
I agree. That would be good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you, Robin Boyle-Laisure. Have a good one.
Take care, Dr. Hassan.
Okay.
Take care.
You.
Bye.
Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.